The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Now today we're going to begin our show with a young saint, Saint Agnes. You know, when we talk about the lives of the saints, and especially martyrs, we think of people that are older. We don't necessarily think of young people. But Agnes was a girl of about 13 who was martyred. And so, you know, and this goes back to the year 304. And so this was before Christianity was legalized. So let's kind of set the scene for the folks that are with us about what was going on in that time and that place prior to her martyrdom.
Well, as you said, it is still illegal to be a Christian. So she has that going against her devout faith, even at a young age. And many might find it difficult, a 13-year-old, to have such strong faith. We have to remember most scholars put Mary at between 13 and 15 when she welcomed the message of the angel Gabriel. And so there is a pattern of young people being so strong in their faith and their connection with God. So Agnes certainly is a young woman of that. The other thing is she is part of a time when women are seen as property, and certainly arranged marriages are all the rage, and she is victim to that. The sadness is that even if that arranged marriage could have become a love match down the road, the arrangement is for her to marry a pagan who is unaccepting of her faith and unaccepting of her devotion to Christ.
What's interesting too is that not only is she very adamant that she does not want to marry this man in this arranged marriage, but she says that the only spouse that I have is Jesus. He's the only one that I want to join my human life with. And so out of anger or out of spite or out of jealousy, this man turns her in to the authorities for being a Christian. He couldn't just let it go, but he had to be rather sinister and devious about it. And so, of course, you know, this is a few years before the Edict of Milan, when Constantine designated Christianity as the religion of the state and legalized it. And so just a few short years before that, we see this young girl being martyred because she would not be willing to give up her faith and renounce her desire to join her life with Jesus.
Well, and I think also we might think it rare, her steadfastness in faith. What is all too common is the response that you speak about in the jilted fiancé. And sadly, isn't that so true? Too often in the current world and we live with, people have a very difficult time getting over rejection, getting over the fact that someone might not want to be with them or might not be in love with them. And instead of just letting it go and moving on to another possibility of love or another possibility or potential of relationship, they have to plot and scheme. Sadly, we hear about things on the internet and things on Facebook and all of these things where people are purposely trying to destroy another's reputation simply out of they were rejected or they weren't wanted. So I wish that Agnes's virtue and faithfulness was as common today as it was in her life then. Sadly, it seems just the response of the fiancé is what's out there. And yet we are still called to that sense of faith and that sense of love and that sense of mercy that Agnes witnessed in her life.
What's interesting is her very name in Latin means lamb. You know, it comes from Agnus Dei, Lamb of God. And so this whole sense that her young life was very innocent, very kind of sheepish, and the quality of something that was gentle and kind. And so it had to be qualities in her life that were so strong and significant that enabled her at a very young age to be so determined not to go through with this marriage to a pagan, but also to withstand and to endure persecution for her Christian faith as well. You know, it's interesting because her feast is on January 21st, and that is significant in the life of the church, especially in the life of those who are metropolitans. It's on that feast that that lambs are shorn, and their wool is made into what we call the palliums that are given to archbishops or metropolitans. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Well, I think, again, as you've mentioned, that happens on her feast day, certainly the connection of lamb, but also the connection of that pure devotion to Christ. And again, that wool is woven into palliums, which are like yokes placed upon the archbishops. And so their service is to be one that in a very pure and a very real way brings people to the devotion of Christ. And those palliums are often given to them on the feasts of Peter and Paul. But that beautiful connection of all the saints, to go back to that life of Agnes in the early church, to see that sense that there is nothing that will stop her from being the bride of Christ. And so we see that even in that relationship with the metropolitan archbishops, you know, that they are uniquely connected to that life of Christ, yoked with that service to bring others into that life as well.
Historically, what's also interesting is that on the pallium itself are what appear to be nails. And so that reminds the metropolitan that they are tied uniquely to the cross of Christ as well. And so certainly the life of Agnes, in her martyrdom, she united herself with Christ and his sufferings on the cross. And so there's that whole culmination in her young life that she nailed herself to the cross with Jesus and ultimately rose with him to new life through the resurrection. And so there's this whole sense that her life at a young age serves as an example to not only older Catholics, but especially younger Catholics as well. We're going to talk about two other women, one a martyr and one another young woman who in her own hands experienced the persecution and the cross of Christ. But we're going to take a quick break. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
I am Marino.
Je suis Marino.
I am Marino.
I believe that we are all connected to each other, and that it is the gift of compassion that unites us and makes us one. It doesn't matter what language, culture, or tradition we come from. We can share compassion wherever we are.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Marino dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, and with your help, they can do more. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. A place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. Where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will give you shelter after a flood. That place is called America, where we look out for each other. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Catherine of Siena. You know, she's got an interesting life. She died at the age of 33, like Jesus. In her own body was the stigmata, the wounds of the nail marks in her own hands. And she's very instrumental in the life of the church. And unlike Agnes, who died in the year 304, this is a woman who is really pre-Renaissance, late 1300s. And what was going on in the life of the country and the church at that time with her?
Well, and when we say pre-Renaissance, it isn't like that can just happen tomorrow. So there were certainly the leadings up of all that the world was going to experience at that time. Certainly in the church, we're seeing a little bit of turmoil, some struggles, some challenges, some divisions, even within the physical location of the seat of power of the church. And so it is the promise and hope of a new time, but still kind of in turmoil with some current happenings. So that is the time frame in which she is in the church. And she is a woman religious. As you mentioned, received the stigmata, is what we refer to also as a mystic. She had visions, and she would receive these visions, and that is certainly what guided and led her on her journey, in a not so subtle way to say, certainly to demand certain things of the church. She would see images of angels and of Jesus, and she would experience these visions and then feel that it was leading her to really not so much be the power behind the throne. We don't want to ever think that Catherine saw herself as that, but to really be one who was urging and nudging the church in the direction that it needed to head.
Well, we know that obviously at that time we're talking about the Papal States in Italy. We're talking about kingdoms and fiefdoms and wars against each other. And we know that Catherine herself was very significant in staving off war within her own town of Siena. And how, if you go to the town itself in Italy, there's this gorgeous cathedral built in her honor. And in it are her relics. Part of the relics include her finger, which legend says that they used to ward off violence and war within the city, and so people venerate that. There's parts of the saint that are celebrated in her life that give us an understanding not only of who she is, but also of what was going on at the time. We know that the papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon. There was lots of disruption because of that, primarily probably because of the warring that was going on within the country of Italy. And so there's this whole sense that through her prayers, through her perseverance, she basically talked the Pope into leaving Avignon and coming back to Rome, and how significant of a move that was, and even for someone at that young age, how really unheard of that would have been, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And again, as we've seen in other saints, what becomes very remarkable, not only the age, but the gender. You know, that there was this woman, you kind of almost get the sense of a Joan of Arc type character, who people are like, why would we listen to this person? What is it about their background, you know? And yet she comes on and she has that persuasive power in her speech, in her action, certainly the images that she had received and was able to relate. It becomes very mystifying, to use the word mystic in a different way. It's very mystifying that she's able to take on this role, yet she does.
What's also interesting is that in her own biological life, she has, at least 23 siblings. She's like the 24th child of a man who is a dyer of wool in Italy. Probably not the same mother, but yet, this whole life that she lived would have been just around the home and taking care of brothers and sisters, or those taking care of her. So this whole family life sense that really becomes disrupted because this young child somehow has these visions, somehow has this sense of the otherness that those around her are not seeing or experiencing. And yet in her mysticism, others are drawn to her, others see power in her. But that's really not what she envisions probably for herself, that she is just an instrument of God's presence, an instrument of God's justice or God's mercy. And so there's this whole sense that in her own life that is very caught up in an otherworldly is brought to an understanding that God is present in humanity in its naturalness.
Absolutely. And looking at the sheer volume of children, we don't know for sure what her role really would have been. Most likely, there would have been brothers and sisters that she might have seen even more in the parental role. Being among the youngest of so many children, she might even have been coddled a little or humored a little, and so she might have been given a little more leeway with some of the things developing in her life. But certainly, what she would have also gained from all that was a little bit more knowledge. You know, when you have all of those other adults or near adults around you, you learn and pick up things a little quicker. So she would have become a little bit more astute, a little more wise for her age, and that worked to her advantage also in then going out into this other role.
We've got about a minute left. When we talk about the life of a young saint, like Catherine of Siena, who died at the age of 33, whose young life was so caught up in so many different things and things that were peculiar to what was going on in life. What do you think that would have said to the people around her? Do you think they would have seen her as odd or strange?
Well, we have to be honest. I'm sure that there was a great segment of the population that thought this was odd. There would have also been those, however, that would have been captivated by what was going on. Probably more so once she was given credence. And not that people jumped on the bandwagon mentality of it. Had she been completely rejected and had the Holy Father not listened or invited her in, she would have been rejected as some fool. But I think certainly the credence that was given to her word, to her place, to her position, allowed others to see something of greater value in her life, and then wanting to then emulate that faith, which is what all the saints offer us.
Exactly. And obviously, being able to cajole and convince the Pope to move from another country back to Rome would have been significant.
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk about the life of another saint whose life was far-reaching as well, but we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
When the U.S. Navy was testing a new torpedo back in 1962, it encountered a strange problem. Whenever the targeting device sent out a sound, it would be answered from underwater. And these mysterious sound waves caused the torpedo to go off course. And for 2 years, the Navy tried to find the source of the interference. And finally, they discovered that the sounds came from dolphins trying to make friends with the torpedo. Friendliness was literally making a weapon ineffective. But consider this. If the innocent sounds of a dolphin can throw a technologically advanced torpedo off course, what might a calm human voice do to diffuse potential conflict? A smile, a sincere compliment, or a word of praise could be the solution to an explosive problem.
This message from the Christophers.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Catherine of Alexandria. Probably not a real well-known saint, but someone that was very significant. And when we talk about Catherine of Alexandria, we can also talk about her as a contemporary of St. Agnes. Let's talk about the beginnings of her life and what was going on in the world at that time.
Well, she was born in the later part of the 3rd century, I believe somewhere around 286, somewhere around that time. And she, like Agnes, did not live a long life. She was martyred just a year after St. Agnes in 305, so she's 14, 15 years old. Some of the differences is she was a convert to the faith. She was part of a noble family, but converted to the faith, at a time when it is still illegal to be a Christian. And so this would have not been received very well by everyone in her family. We don't know if there may have been some other influences, but certainly the far-reaching noble family would not have welcomed this. This would have jeopardized their whole position in society, not just her, but others would have seen that as jeopardizing their place. Some of the things that's interesting is she was imprisoned when it was discovered that she was a convert to the Christian faith. But she, at a young age, drew others to convert to the faith. What ultimately was her demise was that she converted some people that were too well placed in society. And it was seen as a great insult and a great challenge to the emperor.
Of course, what's interesting is that Alexandria being in Egypt, being really a port city that would have been very significant during its time and across the centuries, being the height of dynasties of long before pharaohs who would have seen themselves as gods. And so this whole history of her country being part of her background, and yet embracing the faith that was really fairly new, a couple hundred years when you think about it. And then when we talk about the institutional church in 313 with the Edict of Milan, so there was this young person, as you had mentioned, who was an example for others, and who ultimately converts not only other pagans to the faith, but in particular family members of the dynasties, family members of the ruler or the emperor at the time, and how significant that would have been to martyr someone like that. We know that she is celebrated as a virgin and martyr, and also her martyrdom was rather terrible. As a matter of fact, there is the tool of torture that was used for her is actually named after her. And so subsequent use of this Catherine's wheel was used, and she was the first one to experience this terrible torture. And so, going on at this time, there were probably countless people who were martyred or who were executed because of their faith. We also know that in the life of Joan of Arc, she heard the voice of Catherine of Alexandria in her before going into battle, or if she was converting people in her own time and place. And so the influence of Catherine across the centuries certainly is significant.
Absolutely, and especially for someone like Joan of Arc, there are some great similarities in their youthfulness, in their steadfastness in their faith. They're standing up against the prevailing powers of the time. Joan of Arc has to stand up against the Dauphin and others in the church. Catherine of Alexandria, having converted members of the emperor's own family, incurs his wrath. It's such a great insult that then he seeks to put her to death. But there again, if we were to open up a history book, would we remember by name the emperor who put her to death? We might be able to study a little bit, but who lasts? It's Catherine of Alexandria. It is her story that we seek to emulate. And as you said, probably for every Catherine of Alexandria, there are countless martyrs in those first 3 centuries that we don't know their names or their stories, and yet they all unite in certain martyrs being lifted up to know their story, their collective story. Whether we know it individually or we have a name to put with it, it is the collective story of the early church. Again, as we talked about before, that seed. We hear about how the blood waters the seeds of the church, and that it springs up and grows from that. So we are fortified in these isolated examples, but know that they are merely representative of so many more people who clung to and gave us the faith we have today.
We would probably be remiss if we didn't mention that in the land of Egypt itself, there is an actual monastery at the foot of the hill of Sinai that's called St. Catherine's Monastery. And actually, I had an opportunity to go to the monastery itself. And when you climb Mount Sinai and then come down it, you actually enter into this grand monastery that was built centuries and centuries ago and named in honor of her. We know that the monastery in Sinai is in the Negev, which is the land owned by Egypt that was fought over for many years in between Egypt and Israel. And so there's this whole sense that her presence permeates that whole area, not just from Alexandria, but down throughout the whole Negev, which becomes holy because of the Mount Sinai that Moses climbed. So, there's this whole sense that her life, her faith, her dedication, her perseverance, her sharing the faith with those who do not understand or know Jesus. And how important is that for us in our world, very briefly, because we're going to close, to continue to do that in this day, in this time?
Well, I think especially in this time, we look at an example of a young person, and we look at our young people, not to be cynical about them, but so often that sense of faith and that sense of even how to carry themselves as a person of faith in their conversations, in their dress, in their demeanor, in the activities that they invite into their lives. It's not to be prudish, but it's to say there is a better and a higher aspiration. People like Joan of Arc, people like Catherine of Alexandria, people like Agnes, they remind our young men and young women the great call of dignity and of reverence and respect, not only for God, but for ourselves. And that really needs to be recaptured.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.